so many of you here. So is there a supernatural devil? No, there's not. So we could nearly go home, but what does the Bible say will take a little longer. Tonight's not an exhaustive study by any means, and if afterwards you'd need more detail, please ask and we can give you some more detail. We all know when we are wrong, we love to shift the blame elsewhere. We used to start work early and we had a excuses for sleeping in book, and you would be amazed at the variety of excuses people used to give for sleeping in. The best one was a man said he had to clean the house gutters before his wife would let him come to work. But I looked up this morning on Google, and here's some good excuses for people having accidents. Going to work at 7 a.m. this morning, I drove out of my drive straight into a bus. The bus was 5 minutes early. The next one. The accident happened because I had one eye on the lorry in front, one eye on the pedestrian, and the other on the car behind. And I started to slow down, but the traffic was more stationary than I thought. And last of all, I pulled away from the side of the road, glanced at my mother-in-law and drove over the embankment. And there was lots of other funny ones. But the point really is, we do like to make excuses when something goes wrong. We like to pass the blame. And the first excuse in the Bible, tell me what it was. Who made the first excuse? Eve. And what did she blame?
She blamed the serpent.
That's right. She blamed the serpent.
But Adam blamed God for giving him Eve.
That was the next bit. Adam then blamed Eve. So men and women are prone to sin. Human nature is not improving as some would claim. And many would like to blame a supernatural devil. Imagine how a judge would respond if a man who's in court facing a speeding charge says, "I'm really sorry, but the devil made me do it." Now, the scripture tells us very plainly that we are far away from perfect. In Job chapter 5 and at verse 7, "Yet man is born to trouble as surely as the sparks fly upward." And in Jeremiah, in chapter 17 at verse 7, "But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. He will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit." And straight away afterwards, it's quite surprising in a way, it says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind to reward each person according to their conduct, according to what their deeds deserve." Now, over thousands of years, people have taken comfort in blaming a bad supernatural devil for causing us to sin. And according to the history, that was often the case when there were pandemics or epidemics of sickness where people died. They would like to blame the devil. Now, the words devil and Satan do occur in the Bible, but our challenge tonight is to understand what they mean. The word devil does not occur in the Old Testament, just in the New Testament. And in the New Testament it occurs 57 times, but 24 of those times are describing physical or mental illness. I'm sure you'll remember that. Somebody had a devil and Jesus cast out the devil. So of that, 57 minus 24 leaves 33 other times which are best translated as false accuser, or slanderer. And I'd like tonight to look at two examples. The first one is, you might like to look it up. It's in John chapter 6 at verse 70. It's very brief, but it's to the point. So at John chapter 6 and at verse 70, then Jesus replied, "Have I not chosen you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil." He meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, who, though one of the 12, was later to betray him. Now, clearly, Jesus wasn't believing that Judas was a supernatural bad god. Rather, he was describing him as a traducer, false accuser, or slanderer. And the dictionary meaning of traducer, a word we don't often see, is one who makes false or malicious statements about someone in order to cause humiliation. The other Bible meanings of devil are false accuser or slanderer, which we're probably more familiar with. So there's a case where Jesus called Judas a devil and did not expect that he was a supernatural bad god, clearly. The other one, which is quite a longer discussion, is about the temptation of Jesus soon after he was baptised when he went into the wilderness. And come with me, if you would, to Luke chapter 4, and we'll have a look at that. So Luke chapter 4 at verse 1, Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. And a little later, he ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them he was hungry. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone." The devil led him up on a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, "I will give you all their authority and splendour. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours." Jesus answered, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." And at verse 9, the devil led him to Jerusalem, and so on. And in verse 13, when the devil had finished all this tempting, he left him until an opportune time. Now, in all of these words, the word devil means traducer, false accuser, or slanderer. Jesus was being tested before he began his 3.5 years of preaching, often against severe testing. It's quite simple. So there was no supernatural devil there trying to test Jesus. And you know, friends, there's a saying, where the rubber hits the road. It's not one that I use often, but for us, almost the most important thing to know is in James chapter 1. So if we could have a look at that. James chapter 1 sums it up in a way that makes it so clear we should have no doubt at all. Each one of us knows these words are true. So James chapter 1 at verse 13. When tempted, no one should say, "God is tempting me," for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But listen to this. Each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. If we have a sinful desire which comes into our head and we don't push it out, rather we let it go round and fester and incubate, it will result in us sinning. Similarly, we can be enticed to sin by a bad friend who says, "Come on, it's okay," when we really know it's wrong. So a bad friend can, if you like, be a devil, in the same way that Judas was told by Jesus he was a devil. So the other word that we often look at is the word Satan. And Satan occurs in the Old Testament 14 times and in the New Testament 33 times. The word Satan is basically a Hebrew word as far as I could tell, and it hasn't been translated into something else. It means an opponent, an arch enemy of good, or the accuser. Now, we have a couple of examples where the translators have taken some liberty and they've used a different word for the same word, Satan. I'll give you the example. It was the time when Balaam's ass spoke to him. There's only one ass that ever spoke to anyone, so it's in Numbers chapter 22 and at verse 22. God's anger was kindled because he went and the angel of the Lord stood in the way for an adversary against him. Now he was riding upon his ass, and his 2 servants were with him. And that word adversary is the same word Satan. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, the word Satan is printed in our Bible as Satan 19 times, resist once, and as an adversary 12 times. So that gives you an idea that it can be used in different ways. It'd probably be nice if it was always put in as adversary. Might make it a lot easier for us to understand. And the other one is the adversary in the second case was an angel of God. In fact, the first one was an angel of God. The second one was some of David's soldiers. In 2 Samuel chapter 19 at verse 22, and David said, "What have I to do with you, ye sons of Zeruiah, that ye should this day be adversaries unto me?" Now the word adversaries is Satan's. So his own nephews, his own soldiers were Satan's to David in that occasion. In both of these examples, the Hebrew word translated adversary here is elsewhere translated as Satan. That's really quite important if you're having a discussion with somebody who thinks there is a supernatural devil. It really does make it quite plain. Now I want to move on to Job, that very interesting book which I think tells us about why we suffer. There's no doubt that Job was a real man, no doubt at all. But I think the book is probably written much more like a play and describes the things that happened in Job's life. In the book of Job, Satan is mentioned several times. It is the same Hebrew word as everywhere else and is describing an adversary to Job. Probably someone who was jealous of Job's godliness, who wanted to pull him down to his or her level. The tall poppy syndrome, as we sometimes refer to it these days. Come to Job chapter 1 and verse 1. So Job chapter 1, verse 1. In the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Verse 3. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. And in verse 6. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." And a person who is an adversary, sometimes that's all they do, walking backwards and forwards and criticising wherever they go. And that's what I think this person or persons were doing. And God said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land." And he goes on, "But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." So this Satan was definitely not a supernatural bad God. Can you really imagine the Creator who made all things having a conversation with a supernatural bad God? I don't think so. So the word is used in different ways, sometimes translated as adversary and sometimes Satan. In all cases, simply describing someone who is against someone else. There's Balaam, there's the case of David and his nephews, and Job here. If we come to the New Testament, Jesus describes Peter, a disciple who he had just previously commended for his faith, I think in the same chapter, and it apparently would be within a day or so. You remember when he said to Peter, "On this rock I will build my church"? Peter would have swelled his chest out and walked along in front of everybody, so happy. And yet, soon after, Jesus told him he was a Satan. And that's simply because in that second moment when Jesus called him Satan, he was an adversary to Jesus. Come to Mark chapter 8 with me, if you would. Jesus always knew that in the end he had to suffer death, a cruel and shameful death. And as the time drew near, it says in verse 31 of Mark chapter 8, "He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again." Now he's surrounded by 12 lovely friends who've been with him, and they're saying, "Oh my goodness, surely not." But Peter is always the first one to speak, says, he spoke plainly about this, but Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Just imagine how Peter felt. He thought he was doing the right thing, sticking up for Jesus and saying, "It's okay, it won't happen to you." Jesus knew it had to, and he was struggling with it. So in this case, Peter was an adversary to Jesus and described as Satan. He was trying to undermine Jesus' determination to fulfill God's will by laying down his life for our sins. He was an adversary to Jesus at this moment. Jesus needed support, not to be undermined by one of his closest disciples. Now, where do we get this idea of a devil from? Some who believe in a personal devil point to Isaiah chapter 14 to suggest that Satan is a fallen angel, therefore a supernatural bad god. But clearly when we read the context, we will see a very different story. So if you would, come with me to Isaiah chapter 14. We won't read it all, but there's some very clear words here. In Isaiah 14 at verse 4, describing what the following verses are about, it says that thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, "How hath the oppressor ceased, the golden city ceased? Now, as you all know, Babylon was a mighty power at that time, and it was destroyed by the power of the Medes and Persians. And it goes on, the Lord hath broken the staff of the wicked and the sceptre of the rulers. He who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he that ruled the nations in anger is persecuted, and none hindereth. Now the whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. In verse 10, all they shall speak and say unto thee, art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, and the noise of the vials. The worm is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee. And then it says, and this is where they feel as though this is a fallen angel, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? Well, who weakened the nations? It was Babylon, wasn't it? And right at the end, at verse 16, they that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee and consider thee, saying, is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms? So no supernatural devil there. It's about Babylon. And in verse 22, for I will rise up against them, saith the Lord of hosts, and cut off from Babylon the name and remnant and son and nephew, saith the Lord. So, friends, to sum up, we can clearly see that the words in the Bible, devil and Satan, are describing an adversary, an opponent, an archenemy of good, the accuser. And the simple quotes for us to take home today and to be aware of every day are the one in Jeremiah which says, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? And the other one in James, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Thank you very much.